The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, why are so many permanent residents leaving Canada? Then, former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould speaks with Nam Kiwanuka about her latest book, Reconciling History. That's all ahead on The Agenda. A new report from the Institute for Canadian Citizenship finds that the number of permanent residents leaving Canada is on the rise. What is sparking this exodus? Joining us now to discuss is Daniel Bernhard, CEO of the ICC. It's good to have you back in that chair.
Thanks, Steve.
Let's just show the folks what you already know. We've got some Statistics Canada numbers here to share. And Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring these up right now. They call this onward migration, which basically is a fancy way for saying that's people who are leaving Canada. And this is over the last 20 years. And for those listening on podcast, I'll just describe what we've got here, which is essentially a graph showing what percentage of people who come then leave. And it's a pretty flat line until about 2017 when there's a big spike, but then it comes down again. But now here we are after COVID in 2020, and the line is spiking up again. So what concerns you about that trend?
Well, what we see is this phenomenon of people who are coming to Canada from around the world. And by the way, I should clarify, all the people in this study are permanent residents. So they all have the ability to stay and have chosen not to. We're not talking about temporary workers or international students. And this is, I think, quite alarming. There are a number of different ways to slice it. The view that you just showed is the year of leaving. We can also look at how people are leaving based on the year that they've arrived. What we've seen in that graph is actually a 30-year upward trend. So whilst there are spikes in recent years, conservative governments, liberal governments, all different types of economies, this phenomenon has been silently on the rise. And what does it mean? It means that people who are hand-selected in many respects, economic immigrants are actually the most likely to leave, according to our study. Maybe we'll get into that soon. These people who are hand-selected for their ability to address some of Canada's most pressing economic and social needs in areas like healthcare, early childhood education, et cetera, are increasingly saying thanks but no thanks. And this is troubling because when they leave, the needs that they are brought here to address do not. And so Canada, as a country that's been dependent on immigration, I think should be concerned about this growing trend, not yet at a catastrophe level, but definitely rising and trending in the wrong direction of immigrants who are coming to the country and saying thanks but no thanks.
Can you tell whether they leave after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What?
Yeah, so that's actually a very important finding in our report. The number of immigrants that are projected to leave the country is about 20% over the long term, 20 to 25 years. But what we find is that most of that leaving happens in the first 7 years. And so there is this real spike in the graph between years 3 and 7 where the risk of departure is highest. It's like danger zone territory. But it's also actually an opportunity for intervention. If Canada can make those early years winning years, amazing years, satisfying years, such that people with these great talents from around the world decide, my decision to come here, this was the right move. This is the place where I would like to devote my talents and my energies to the country's success. This is the place where I belong and where my family belongs. That is to the great benefit of all Canadians, not just the immigrants who are coming here. But if we can't get people past that year 7 hump, then we lose on everything that they have to contribute. So that's, I think, what's at stake here.
On the other hand, I'll play devil's advocate here. You can imagine people who have been here for a few generations saying to themselves, this is a pretty good place to live in this world for a lot of people. And if they don't want to stick around, well, good riddance. What's wrong with thinking that way?
Well, this is a very good place to live. I'm, really fortunate to live here, and I really enjoy living here, as do, I imagine, most of your viewers, even those who have other options to live elsewhere. I think what this reflects, though, is a really dramatic change in the nature of who's coming. So, my parents came to Canada from South America, and they were, 18 and 19. One had finished high school, one had to finish over here. They spoke relatively little English, the proverbial $5 in your pocket.
What was their first language?
Spanish. They came from Chile. And Chile was in the midst of a coup and a dictatorship and all that kind of stuff. Look, everything in Canada was upside. Well, people who are coming today are coming in dramatically different circumstances. If you are applying in the point system today in Canada, you need to be basically in the top 5 percentile to be admitted. So that means that we are rejecting 95 to 96% of people who are applying. That's a level of competitiveness on par with Harvard University. So who are we getting? We're getting people who speak English and French, often both, impeccably well. We're getting people with advanced education and master's degrees. We're getting people, therefore, who were homeowners, who had domestic help in their country of origin, who came from 2-car, 2-driver households. These are people from the top of very unequal societies. And so they have a lot of different things to contribute than my parents had at the time, for example, but they also have global options. And so instead of immigration being a manifestation of our generosity as a country, which I think our conversation, our public debate still reflects that frame, immigration needs to shift as we need to talk about this as a reflection of our ambition and as an admission, quite frankly, that an aging and shrinking society is a poorer, weaker, and less fun place to live. We need immigrants in many cases much more than they need us. And so the profile of the contemporary immigrant has changed a lot. The discourse around immigration has changed hardly at all. And the services that are available to immigrants have also changed, in my opinion, far, far too slowly. So like language classes, for example, are the #1 government-funded settlement service. 60% of immigrants are economic immigrants who have to take a language test as a condition of entry. And so many of them don't use these services. They're just not appropriate. Instead of thinking about how we can fix immigrants to improve their language skills and give them CV training, et cetera, because they need help, we need to start thinking about how we can sell these very talented people with global options on Canada so that they decide, this is my place. These are my people. This is where I belong. And this is where I would like to devote my talents and energies in the long term. That's what's at stake for Canada. We need, I think, to work a little bit harder to win over the affections of these talented people. And I should just add one more thing. This is not an issue of like promiscuity or disloyalty. These are people who are doing what you or me or anyone else watching the show would do. Make a big decision to uproot your family and move to another country. Give it 4, 5, 6 years to see how it's going. And if you don't think it's working out, you'll pursue other options.
Do those other options include, maybe you could tell me which is more prevalent, going back to their country of origin, or are they picking yet another country to go to?
So we don't know that from this data. We suspect most of the returning is to the country of origin. I know there's a lot of interest, for example, in moving to the United States, but that's actually really hard to do.
Harder now, I would think.
Harder now, yeah, for sure. So we have more work to do there, but we do know that they're not staying in Canada, and that's the prime concern here.
Daniel, do we know if they're just homesick?
Well, one of the theories is that the nature of global migration is changing. You know, with FaceTime and YouTube, you can practically live in another country nowadays, culturally at least. You're not disconnected by distance in the way that you once were. Maybe that is the case, but if that's the case, then perhaps our conceptualization of permanent residency and the path to citizenship also need to adapt accordingly. I think, though, that the numbers still suggest in our testimonies, and our organization, through our Canoe Pass, which gives newcomers free access to over 2,000 culture, nature, and sport experiences, so that they fall in love with the country and stay.
For a year, right?
Well, it's for a year. It's actually for 5 years now.
5 years, okay.
They get a little bit less every year, but they're able to stay for a little bit longer. We're in touch with over 410,000 verified adult immigrants. That's more than almost all other settlement services in Canada combined. And what they tell us is that they're really looking to make a go here. They really want to stay. They really want to contribute. They're idealistic about Canada. They have very positive impressions of Canadians. They feel welcomed at a personal level. But if the economic stuff in many cases doesn't click, and remember, we're taking high-status individuals from their country of origin, then they'll pursue other options. One of the questions that's raised here is whether this idea of picking the highest status people from their country of origin is in fact a good idea. To your point about people who came 40 or 50 years ago, are we being a bit too snobby, perhaps? That's, I think, a reasonable question to ask. But the point is that just 2 weeks ago, for example, Canada invited over 3,000 people with healthcare expertise to become permanent residents. we're all complaining about, difficulties accessing medical services. Anyone who's waiting for a specialist, can testify to this. Some people might worry about, are we adding too many immigrants for our country's healthcare capacity to be able to hold? But we have to also remember that immigrants don't just consume stuff. They are producing things, including these people, for example, who will contribute to our healthcare system's success in the long term. So it's a more complicated discussion than that. And so long as these needs persist, then our national interest in retaining people hand-selected to fulfill those needs will also persist.
I do wonder, though, I guess I should ask whether or not this really is a problem at all, only in as much as we have seen over the last few weeks, the federal government has really, done a U-turn on immigration. It was, unambiguously up and up and up and up over the last many decades, and now they've definitely put the brakes on. If there are fewer people who come here who decide to stay, maybe that's a bit of a safety valve for that problem?
I think that is a sort of superficially sensible understanding, but when you probe a little bit deeper, it starts to break down. We live in a democracy where, at least some of the time, public opinion becomes public policy, and that's clearly what's happened here. Canadians have been bombarded for about 2 years with messages that are biggest failings, many generations in the making, like a shortage of affordable housing, healthcare issues, which have been a problem on the front page of the newspapers my entire life, that these issues are suddenly attributable not to our own mismanagement of our governance, but to people who came last week. This mathematically does not make sense, but also it fails to incorporate for the fact that immigration is a two-sided ledger. So if we were to take 10% of the immigrants out of the country, for example, maybe we would take 10% of people out of the hospital waiting room, but we would take 30 or 40% of the people out of the hospital staff room. And anybody who's been to a hospital can testify who's working there. So, I would invite your viewers to do the math and think about whether this is a good trade for Canada. In the construction trades, for example, we have a huge boom of retirements that are currently unfolding and continuing to unfold. Speak to any of the construction companies. They are bringing in large numbers of temporary foreign workers to meet their goals, not to lift shovels, to be supervisors and project managers at very high levels and very high wages, because we are just missing that layer here. So we can reduce the number of people all we want. The Federal Minister of Immigration and the Prime Minister said, well, this will reduce our housing targets. We'll need to build fewer houses. Then, like 2 weeks later, CMHC releases data saying housing starts in Ontario plummet to new lows. So there are more moving pieces here than just the number of people piling on to the system. And to simply blame all of our failings amassed over many, many years on the number of people coming, particularly when many of those people are selected for their ability to address precisely those failings, I think just doesn't serve us very well as a country. We need to consider both sides of the ledger.
In which case, let me ask you about something very symbolic, the passport. You and I probably both grew up being told that the passport was really gold. It was a beautiful thing to be able to show anyone around the world. And in fact, I can recall, not that long ago, there was a great counterfeit ring where people wanted to create fake Canadian passports because they were so accepted all over the world. Does it not have the lure it once had?
It doesn't. So naturalization rates among newcomers, among permanent residents rather, who are able to do so have declined by 40% between 2001 and 2021. This will come as a shock to many people. It came as a shock to me. I mean, this question about retention, about naturalization rates, I started in my job 3 years ago and I said, all right, what's happening, And I decided to look, and no one actually knew the answers to these things. So we had to find out ourselves. We were surprised by the results too. And the funny thing is that when we ask immigrants why they're choosing to leave to other countries, lack of affordable housing is the number one answer. But when we ask them why they are considering not becoming Canadian citizens, lack of affordable housing is also the number one answer. And it's interesting because it's the number one answer across income groups. Even people who are making a lot of money are not feeling optimistic about their ability to build wealth and to build a base here in their future. And so optimism for the future really seems like actually the core thing here. And many Canadians are professing a lack of optimism in the future, and it's no wonder then that immigrants who also live here, amongst all of us who consume the same media, are feeling the same way.
I got some numbers on this. Okay, rate of Canadian citizenship declining. Here's what the citizenship rate has been among adults who met the minimum residency requirements. Sheldon, we got this graphic here. Can we bring this up? Top of page 3. Those who landed in 1996 65% of them obtained citizenship 5 years later. That's a pretty healthy number. Of those who arrived in 2006, only 44% obtained their citizenship by 2011. And of those who arrived in 2016, again, if you look 5 years later in 2021, 22% obtained citizenship. So we go from almost 30 years ago to about 2/3 of people obtaining citizenship, now down to 2 in 10. What story is that telling?
Well, I mean, processing delays during the pandemic probably affect the last number, but even if it's, not 20%, but 30%, right? It's still a major decline.
Yeah.
I was telling the National Press Gallery last week when we announced this study, I said, Canada's still a great place. It's an affluent and an abundant and welcoming place. I think Canadians really do have a warm and welcoming heart. But we'd also do well to maybe get over ourselves a little bit, Steve. Like, there are countries around the world where we are sourcing immigrants from, India, China, the Philippines, that have progressed immensely in the last 30 or 40 years. Like, India no longer has a paper currency. Even the poorest street peddler is doing their business on their phone. People are coming here and they're wondering why our healthcare system is run on fax machines. We send them to immigration services to learn how to deal with the Canadian financial system. We teach them how to write paper checks. They laugh. And then in the employment sector, we're saying, well, do you have Canadian experience? Is that sufficient? And they're going like, what are you talking about? We're light years ahead of you in some of these ways. And so this, I think, speaks to really the main prescription here for all of Canada, not just for the government, but for each of us. It's a double dose of humility, because we are still, like I said, thinking of immigration as a manifestation of our compassion. Like, people are coming from horrible places. And of course, you're welcome to come here. Maybe not so many. Maybe, we can't handle it all. These are just limits on our generosity, on our capacity for generosity. But what about our open-mindedness to what people from around the world can teach us, to what we can learn?
Self-interest.
Exactly. And to having a team built up of stars from around the world who want to play for our team. When I speak in public, I often talk about Alphonso Davies, the captain of the men's Canadian soccer team, who came to Canada as a refugee and played his very first game for Team Canada either the same day or the next day after getting his Canadian citizenship. And when he goes to work, he literally wraps himself in the Canadian flag because he believes in this place and he feels like he was welcomed here, and we've attained, incredible success on the soccer field as a result. But this plays out in every domain of society. When you have people from around the world who want to play for your team and contribute all they've got, we should say yes. We should say yes. And we are closed-minded right now about what the rest of the world has done, how they have moved in many cases faster than us. And the tragedy of all this is that we have the people who are already here, who can teach us amazing things and who are bridge builders to global markets, who have a lot to contribute. But instead of asking them what they can teach us, we simply ask them if they can meet our standard, as though our standard is naturally and always the highest one. I think that really says a lot about how Canadians' mentality about immigration is backwards. And if you are an immigrant on the other side of this ledger, you experience this enough times and it starts to get frustrating, and we see that all the time. So no wonder the economic immigrants with the highest points, with the highest global experience, are also now showing us that they are the most likely to be leaving the country. This takes its toll after a while, and it takes its toll not on immigrants, it takes its toll on Canada. This is not something that you should feel badly about because an immigrant was discriminated against or had a rough experience here. I mean, you should. But if that's a nurse that's no longer healing our patients, that's all the patients in the waiting room who suffer. This is an all of Canada problem, and we ought to be talking about it more in those terms.
Well, follow up on that. We got a minute left here. What should we do?
Well, I think first of all, we should have retention targets. There is no one right now in any government in Canada who is mandated to deal with retention as their job. So I think that's something that we definitely ought to look at. We ought to take a broader view of settlement services beyond just fixing people's deficiencies and thinking about ways to sell them on Canada. Like our canoe program, there are others that are thinking more broadly like this. But most importantly, I think we should try and eschew a longstanding Canadian tradition of just pointing our fingers at various governments. This is something that we can all contribute to. Think about what makes your quality of life positive in your community. Is it government policy? Sometimes. but it's also your experience as an employer, as a colleague, as a neighbor, as standing on the sidelines while your kids are playing soccer. If these people really are hand-selected to be able to address some of our most pressing needs, then each of us can do our best to make that welcome warm and enduring, because I think Canada really can have and become more. But we need to be able to say yes to these incredible contributions that people are willing to make. And if they're giving up on Canada, that's a disturbing sign that I think each of us ought to address ourselves towards.
Fascinating study. Thanks for coming in and talking about it.
Thanks for having me.
That's Daniel Bernhard, CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship.
Does the narrative of Canada change when we listen to Indigenous voices? In her new book, co-written with lawyer and educator Jeyan Jeganathan, Jody Wilson-Raybould sets out to tell the history of this country by incorporating voices we don't always hear. It's called Reconciling History, A Story of Canada. She's also a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. And Jody Wilson-Raybould joins us now for more. Hi.
Hi.
It's really nice to have you here. This is a really terrific book.
Thank you.
It's very dense, but it has so much information in it. You co-wrote this book with fellow lawyer and advocate Jeyan Jeganathan. How did that partnership come about?
Yeah, I'm really proud to have been able to co-author this with Jeyan. He and I have worked together for almost 15 years. When I was the regional chief for the BC Assembly of First Nations, I hired Jeyan to assist with developing principles around the recognition of Indigenous rights. And we've never separated since. And he, in fact, was one of my legal advisors when I was Minister of Justice. So he came to Ottawa with me. So we have a very close working relationship, and he's a dear friend.
You can tell there's a great synergy in this book. In the book, you examine the idea that Canada lacks a common memory. What is missing from the dominant narrative of our history?
Just differing perspectives and reflections of reality. In terms of the book, we seek to actually incorporate those differing perspectives, the perspectives that have been lost or not heard in our different periods of history of Indigenous voices and their experiences in terms of the legacy of colonization. And we try to do that and throughout the different time periods, but also bringing in non-Indigenous voices from differing perspectives to move beyond that predominant narrative that so many of us have been taught, which is the narrative that's told by the few, as opposed to the many. In Canada, there are a lot of differing voices that haven't been heard.
It felt as if we were hearing from witnesses, depending on whatever time period you were talking about. What I thought was really interesting, and this is a line that stuck out to me from the book, you wrote that there is no neutral telling of a story. What did you mean by that?
Well, history is not static. History is dynamic. It's constantly changing, and we need to look at words and look at words carefully in the context in which they were spoken, at the time in which they were spoken. And throughout the book, as we come into the present, at the very beginning, the voices of Indigenous peoples were far fewer, and the voices of non-Indigenous peoples were greater, and that changes with reconciling our colonial history. So when we come up to the present day, the voices of Indigenous peoples are speaking more loudly and more openly about what needs to be done in terms of reconciliation. But understanding that words matter, and we need to understand how those words were spoken in what context, and have the ability to be a bit self-reflective about the words that we hear.
I thought it was interesting too, because you're asking the reader of your work to also interrogate what it is that you're writing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, revisiting or thinking about history is what the book also, talks about history, but also how we think about history and whose voices we're listening to. I mean, the predominant narrative of the history of this country as told by non-Indigenous peoples are the so-called fathers of Confederation, Upper and Lower Canada, and the history that's spoken about Indigenous peoples, that when Canada was formed, Indigenous peoples were not there. We were left out. Very different stories, but stories that reflect the siloed nature of history and the siloed reality of the history of Canada because of the legacy of colonization.
And in order to cover Canadian history since before colonization, the book is organized into sections based on different parts of a totem pole on the Kincombe Inlet on the coast of British Columbia.
Yeah.
We have a photo of the pole here. What is the significance of this artwork?
This is a pole that was raised in my grandmother's home community of Kincombe back in 1936. And I'm certainly not an expert on the pole. There are far more knowledgeable people in our community. But the significance of the pole and why we sought to frame the book around it is the pole was raised at a time, a very dark period in Canada's history where, the Indian Act was coming into its full force. Children were being removed from communities. It was against the law to raise matters of rights if you were an Indigenous person. And the pole, for me, when I look at it, signifies many things, but it signifies, it is art, but it is the history of my people, the Musqueam, Tsawo'danic people. It reflects our lineage, our worldview, and the four crests on the pole represent the four tribes of the Musqueam and how we come together and need to work together. But it also reflects the reality of the history of colonization and the fight of Indigenous peoples for justice, because it was raised at a time after the death of King George V, at the height of the imposition of colonial rule. It speaks about the relationships of my people, but also the relationships between my people and the non-Indigenous peoples who were coming in more and more force.
When you were talking about your connection to your family with the totem pole, I could see a lot of pride on your face.
Yeah.
How come?
Well, we dedicate this book to the Musqueam Tsawo'danic people, which is where I come from, which is my grandmother's community. She's the matriarch of our clan, and she taught me who I was. And the pole speaks to who our people are and how beyond memory, beyond clans and creation, it speaks about our creation and our resilience and how we have worked together in the face of many different challenges. But it also speaks to, I think importantly, what we need to do as individuals, as human beings, to ensure that we can overcome many challenges, including the challenges that we face today, and recognizing that we need to move forward together.
There are four sections on the pole, but you write that this does not represent a hierarchy like some people might think. Because I think for a lot of people, when they see a totem pole, they imagine one thing.
I think, a lot of people look at a totem pole and say, oh, that's a beautiful piece of art, which is why we, in the book, and this is a metaphor for history. History is constantly changing. We encourage people to look at the totem pole from many different perspectives and angles, standing farther away from it and standing closer to it, but to truly understand what that pole means. For my people, they're four crests. They represent the first ancestor of each of our tribes, but they also, in terms of the book, represent different time periods or eras in our history where there has been impact in terms of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
You mentioned the first ancestor, and that's one of the four poles, four parts of the pole. How does oral history and storytelling differ from how many Canadians may be used to thinking about the history of this country?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm a big advocate for storytelling. And I think the main reason for that is my people and Indigenous peoples, I think, generally have oral history. We didn't have a written language. So in order to pass down our customs and our traditions and our values and our worldview, who we are, we needed to continue to tell those stories from generation to generation. And this is why the book is constructed as it is, as an oral history. If we do not tell the truth of our history, then our culture would die. So when the pole was raised, it needed to be witnessed by the chiefs and the community members of the 4 tribes and surrounding areas to recognize why the pole was raised, about the importance of ensuring that we maintain relationships between and amongst ourselves, but also remembering who we are in the face of outside forces coming in to try and eliminate who we are. This was the reality back in the 1930s in terms of colonization.
You said that before the history wasn't written, and you've told the oral history in a book.
Yeah.
So in fact, it's now written. What does that mean for you and part of what it means for your legacy?
Well, I think what it means for the legacy of Indigenous peoples, of which I'm one, of course, and proud to be so. I think that Indigenous peoples in this country have a lot to teach others, non-Indigenous peoples, about their worldview, our way of life, which is rooted in community, wherein everybody has a role to play to ensure that community functions the way that it should. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be a member of Parliament and to be a minister, and I went to Ottawa wanting to create the space for Indigenous peoples in this country to rebuild their nations. And what I learned, many things, but what I learned in particular was that Parliament and the way we govern in our society could learn a lot from my people who have been able to survive in the face of many challenges for millennia, in the ways and the means and the respectful patterns of behavior that have enabled that to be so.
I have a structure of the interview, but I need to follow up on something you just said, because when I said your legacy, you said our legacy, community that you come from. But when you were in Ottawa, it was just you. And I can imagine the weight of representing a peoples that are not monolithic,
Very
by the
diverse,
way.
yeah.
What was that like for you? How did you carry that weight, or maybe how did you carry that power?
Well, I was incredibly proud to be a member of Parliament and to be made a minister of the Crown. It was never anything that I could have imagined when I was growing up. It was I guess an accomplishment for me, and not a guess. It was an accomplishment for me, but I believe it was a huge accomplishment across the board, wherein there was the first Indigenous person to be Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General. That means something. What happened in terms of my story is what happened, but I know, and I take hope in this, is that I know I was the first, but we are in the age of the Thunderbird and resilience and resurgence. I know I'm not going to be the last Indigenous person to hold that title and other titles within government.
So the next, if we go back to the poll, we have the raven, and then after the raven, we have the wolf. You talked a little bit about your grandmother. How does she work to preserve the traditions of the big house when we talk about the wolf?
Well, the wolf, they hunt in packs, and the wolf in this part of the book, part 3 of the book, it speaks to their resistance and the advocacy that we saw visibly and invisibly during a period of time, leading to the constitutional conferences. My grandmother, her traditional name was Pugladi, and she and others of her generation had to toil in the shadows. The only way to preserve our way of life and our culture and our laws and traditions, the big house and the potlatch, was to do it in the shadows. If they had done it publicly, it would have been put down. It would have been struck down because it was illegal at the time. So my grandmother, our people, even when it was against the law, would potlatch. And we would have lookouts on the river and on the roadways for the Indian agents, the RCMP, coming. And when they were seen to be coming, we would switch from doing the work of the big house to singing Christian hymns or other things that the Indian agents accepted.
This duality, huh?
Yeah, these workings of my grandmother and others to keep our traditions alive, to keep the big house alive, so future generations, my generation, those to come, could know it, live it, and understand it, was an incredibly bold form of leadership and a reflection of the wolf hunts and in the shadows. But we're coming out of those shadows, and I and others have the opportunity to be completely visible. And this is because things are changing, because there are more voices. Laws have changed, not nearly enough, but we're coming out of the shadows, and it's pretty hopeful and an exciting period of time.
And it was also a form of resistance. And one of the voices that a lot of Canadians are familiar with is Elder Murray Sinclair, a lifelong advocate who recently passed away. How does his legacy fit into the story of Indigenous resistance and resilience?
Yeah, well, I was, like with everybody, saddened to hear. I knew he was been sick for some time, but of his passing. He leaves an extraordinary legacy. He was the first in many different situations throughout his life. But Murray will be remembered for many things, but in particular for being the chief commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which he, along with the other commissioners, interviewed so many survivors of the Indian residential school system and brought out into the light for so many Canadians the reality of that history, the reality of the experiences of Indigenous peoples and what happened and how children were taken away and the impacts that has to this day. So Murray will be remembered for shining a light on that very dark period in our history and being a first of many, and I'm proud to have known him.
The last section of the King Kong poll is the Thunderbird. I wanted to read a part of it from what you wrote in the book. What we are now bearing witness to is the taking flight of Indigenous peoples in contemporary Canada, the vibrancy of our young people, the creative explosion of our arts and culture, the energy of sport and the determination of our athletes, the emergence of our people as leaders in politics and business, the accomplishments of our Indigenous professionals, the rebuilding of our nations and governments, and revitalization of our Indigenous laws and legal orders. What are some of the things that make you hopeful about the future?
Just reading those words, I feel them, and I have the great fortune of being able to travel extensively around the country, and the big question that people ask me is, what can I do to help advance reconciliation? And it's happening more and more with increasing frequency. Canadians are learning our history, our true history, and are seeking to understand different worldviews and how worldviews create the world that we live in, and wanting to be what I like to call in-betweeners, to break down the silos between and among us, to relate as human beings and recognize our interconnectedness and our interdependency. That to me is so hopeful. I know that it's Canadians in their own individual lives, and they reflect this to me, that are going to transform and continue to transform our reality, to draw more out into the light those Indigenous stories, assist in the rebuilding work that needs to be done. But yeah, we're in the period of the Thunderbird. As I said earlier, the Thunderbird represents strength. It represents power and resurgence. And yes, that's true for Indigenous peoples, but we have so many others, Canadians generally, that want to assist in creating the change and more respectful patterns of behavior, of relationships, as was envisioned when the King Kong poll was raised.
I think in recent years, I know for myself, I didn't learn about residential schools, but now I know about them. And throughout the country, a lot of Canadians, when they learn the history, they learn about what's happened in this country. Yeah. They're appalled, and they want to take responsibility and to move forward in reconciliation. Yeah. But we're also having people who are denying the truth of this country. So can we have reconciliation if some people can't accept the truth?
Yeah, it's a great question. Roshan and I actually just recently wrote an opinion piece in the Toronto Star that spoke to the rise in residential school denialism. I mean, on the one hand, a charitable view is that people are having conversations, and I don't agree with their views in terms of denying the reality of residential schools, but at least they're engaged in the conversation. But I mean, the reality is those comments dehumanize Indigenous lives and realities. The vast majority of people have read the TRC report, or at least part of it. There's numerous pieces of evidence that reflect that so many children were taken away from their homes and never returned. Look, we have a long way to go in terms of achieving true reconciliation. There are voices that are going to be completely adverse to that, but there are more voices that are wanting to do things. Change is hard, and we need to stick to it and draw out into light as much as possible and have conversations with people that see things in a contrary way, reinforce the experiences of Indigenous peoples, and for those Canadians, which is the vast majority of them, recognize and embrace those realities and experiences, and try to do, as Georges Erasmus' quote talks about, create that common memory, because without that common memory of who we are as a people and how we got to this moment in time, we can't build a shared future. And I think the vast majority of people want to do that.
You come back from a background in law, and throughout the book we learn how the law has been used against Indigenous peoples, but also how those communities have used the law to fight back. You've written 3 books now. Why pursue storytelling?
Well, it's how people and ideas, well, it's how people survive, and it's how ideas are advanced and debated and discussed. I mean, we talked earlier, I have the great fortune of being in and playing many different roles, and I've learned a lot of different lessons from those roles, so I feel a responsibility to impart what I learned, and whether that be in my political memoir or, importantly, around one of the biggest issues I see facing the country, which is equality and equity and inclusion and justice, and ensuring that everybody can play their role, including Indigenous peoples. I believe it's one of the most important issues facing our country.
One of the frustrating things that I felt when I was reading the book was that when governments change, you would have a government that was committed to making change, and then the government would change, and then you'd have another government that was not as committed, and you also comment in the book that so many reports have been commissioned, but so few of the recommendations have been implemented. How do we go beyond identifying the same problems to actually solving them?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what government is in Ottawa. Indigenous peoples and people who want to move on reconciliation have faced the same challenge, is that there's commitment, but there's no necessary follow through in terms of transforming laws, policies, and practices. But I will say, when I was first elected regional chief, we had to sit around with other leaders and talk about how we can get Canadians even to take note of Indigenous peoples or the idea of reconciliation. We're in a very different time now where people from all walks of life are wanting to do more. This is how social change happens, people wanting to do their part, play their role. It's not governments or leaders in Ottawa or at Queen's Park or anywhere else across the country that create the change. It's each of us as Canadians in our own individual lives, taking steps and building on previous actions. That's how the change happens. The great moments in history happen by each of us doing our part.
I'd like to take a look at a clip from a different time in your life, and this is a quote you actually mentioned in the book. Let's take a look.
I was taught to always be careful what you say because you cannot take it back. I was taught to always hold true to your core values and principles and to act with integrity. These are the teachings of my parents, my grandparents, and my community. I come from a long line of matriarchs, and I am a truth teller, in accordance with the laws and traditions of our big house. This is who I am, and this is who I always will be.
Of course, that was your time in Canadian politics. You made sure to stay true in your culture and values. Is this the way forward for Indigenous-Crown relations?
I think so. In writing this book, reconnected with the story of the Kinkum Pole and the reality of what has made my people so strong. Those are the values that I spoke about in that clip. It makes me emotional thinking about it, because the way that I was able to sit in that space and speak about who I am and what I was experiencing and what I knew my job was. To do that in the face of however many people were watching was because I was rooted in who I am, and knowing where I come from, and knowing the strength that comes from a people that work together and what can be accomplished when we do work together. Mm-hmm. I mean, the closing of the book has a chapter called Kimola, which means many walking together. I think that is how we are going to as a country, and we just need to look around the world to see how challenged we are in so many different respects. And if COVID and other issues have taught us anything, it's how fundamentally interconnected and interdependent we are. And we need to recognize that. That's the common memory of where we've come from, but understanding that in order to tackle the big challenges faced by humanity at this time, we need to listen to each other and find solutions. We're going into political season here in this country, and I hope that people who want to hold office or to be elected understand that we don't actually, we're not able to arm ourselves to combat these challenges unless we actually are firing on all cylinders, which means bringing all voices in to solve these complex problems. That's what gave me the strength to sit in that place.
It must have been lonely.
You know, it wasn't lonely, and I was there on my own, but more than ever, it was voices from right across the country, whether they stopped me in an airport, sent me emails, sent me text messages, reached out on social media. And it wasn't just Indigenous peoples, it was non-Indigenous peoples as well who identified with something that I said or an experience that they had in their own lives where they faced challenges and they had to determine how they would lead, what type of leader they would be, whether they spoke out, you know, in corners or publicly. People wanting to see people speak truth to power and have integrity and be genuine, I guess, and authentic in who they are. So I heard tons of stories like that, and it was very heartwarming and made me feel like in that moment I was not alone.
Thank you so much for giving us such a generous interview. Really appreciate it, and thank you for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.
I think this is a really incredibly important book for not just Canadians, but for everyone to read. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Always looking for more about what's going on at Queen's Park? Nerd Out with Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath and the On Poly podcast. Fridays on the agenda, anytime on TVO.org or the podcast platform of your choice.
From a very young age, Lola Reid Allin's eyes were drawn to the sky.
When I was a little girl, I'd walk home and I was fascinated by the clouds. I guess I've always just wanted to be up there flying with the birds.
Her fascination with aviation started with the aerial acrobatics of the Royal Canadian Air Force's Golden Hawks, seen here in the CBC archival footage. Her first flight came during a family trip from Toronto to the prairies. 7-year-old Lola didn't know it then, but she was destined for a career up above the clouds.
It was like a roller coaster ride at the fair. It was in 1962. We were going from Toronto to Regina for a family reunion. And we'd gone many times before. We'd by car, by train, never by airplane. In 1962, people just did not hop into airplanes.
Growing up in the 60s, the trip would serve as a reminder that a career in aviation for women was just a foolish dream.
They were good people, just not attentive parents. And my father was very definitely misogynist. So when I said, hey, Dad, this is great. When I grow up, I want to be a pilot, it was like, don't be silly. Girls don't fly.
The Belleville, Ontario native is now sharing her journey as a pilot in her memoir, Highway to the Sky, An Aviator's Journey.
So I'm just checking the fuselage here just to make sure that it isn't visibly dented or are there any problems.
Throughout her 3-decade career, Lola worked as a pilot, flight instructor, and commercial aviator. These days, she doesn't get up in the air as much as she did as a working pilot, but we met up with her at the Durham Flight Center in Oshawa, Ontario, to return to her happy place.
All right, so you're both still buckled in. It was empowering. I remember the first time I went solo, the plane literally just whooshed off into the air. It was again a beautiful day. And I do like to fly solo. It's quiet and no one has any expectations of you, except to get the plane back down on the ground.
There were, however, many expectations of women at the time, none of which included them flying thousands of feet in the sky. Women pilots have always been far and few between, even though they've been flying as long as men.
The first licensed female pilot was Ramon de la Roche in France, March 8th of 1910. But because of, social constraints, social expectations, women didn't fly. And there were no role models.
It would take several more years after her maiden flight before Lola would learn to fly. With a child and secure career in banking, her then husband surprised her with flight lessons.
When the instructor asked if I wanted to take control, I said, no way, I want to have a lesson first before I take control. I was pretty much in awe of all the instrumentation. There's a lot of, bells and whistles inside. I was a little daunted.
That lesson would be the beginning of a new chapter. Lola would divorce and leave her job at the bank to pursue a full-time career in aviation. She would amass many firsts in her more than 6,000 hours in the air.
I didn't really feel any challenges until I started, as my grandfather so eloquently put, started taking jobs away from men. Then I started really getting the pushback. And part of that, again, from my colleagues, was that they didn't understand why. Their mothers were stay-at-home moms. Their girlfriends or wives were. I was the odd person out, and I was trying to fit in. A couple of them were definitely against me, but most of them were they just really didn't understand why I wanted to do it.
According to Lola, fewer than 6% of commercially licensed pilots are women, a number that hasn't grown since the 80s. Tales of gender discrimination in the aviation industry are well documented. In 1934, Helen Ritchie, the first female commercial pilot, had to fight for her place in the sky.
She didn't last very long because the all-male flight crew basically drummed her out of business. They persuaded what is now the Federal Aviation Authority in America that women shouldn't fly at night and they shouldn't fly in poor weather conditions. You're going to have bad weather days, it's going to be nighttime. And so within a few months, she quit. But it wasn't until nearly 40 years later, 1973, that the first 3 commercial pilots were hired in Canada and America. 1 in Canada, 2 in America.
Lola has faced blatant and subtle forms of sexual discrimination during her career. She's been offered preferential treatment in return for sexual favors, lost jobs to less experienced male pilots, and been mistaken for a flight attendant.
On some of the northern bases where we'd have to load baggage, that's normally the job of the first officer, so I'd be out there loading baggage, and men would be aghast that I would be loading the baggage, and some men would literally try and pull the bags from my hand, and I was like, no, you wouldn't ask a man if he was capable of doing that, so just let me do it. So what I would actually do, because after a while it gets pretty frustrating, I would take the suitcase and I would just whoof it into the baggage, and it would ricochet around. And again, those are well-meaning people, but in essence, though they're well-meaning, they're still also saying in their mind, oh, she's not really capable of doing this job, or where's the guy?
Just 10 years ago, a female pilot of a WestJet flight was left this note from one of her male passengers. It reads, "The cockpit of airliner is no place for a woman. A woman being a mother is the most honor, not as captain. I wish WestJet could tell me a fair lady is at the helm so I can book another flight.
And I thought, this is the kind of stuff that I put up with. What's going on? And then it was that point I decided that what I didn't really want to go fly commercially anymore, but what I wanted to do was encourage more young women to become pilots.
Lola is a member of the 99s, an international organization that provides networking and mentorship for professionals and recreational female pilots. She's also part of the Northern Lights Aero Foundation here in Canada with the same goal, to inspire the next generation of female aviators.
I proved to myself that I could believe in myself and I could accomplish something that was different, that was worthwhile. I'd like to hope that people will be inspired that despite the odds, you can achieve your goals, to think about what you might really want to do and go for it, even if it's not in aviation. Because I do talk about a lot of other things. It's a snapshot of what life was like for many women and what the expectations were. And I still think that in the back of many people's minds, those expectations are still there.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, November 26th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, we look at the impact the incoming Trump administration is likely to have on the war in the Middle East. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.
Coming up Thursday on the agenda.
What we've seen so far is that there's a big pushback against incumbency. And to me, that suggests that there's a great deal of discontent with the current arrangement. And whether that means late capitalism in some kind of death throes, environmental and climate crisis, or simply just a kind of shift of thinking about the nature of government and the relationship of citizens to government, that really is going to take a long time to shake out.
That's Thursday on the agenda.